Okay, guys, so here we are on the second piece of the respiratory structure lecture, and we're going into the lower respiratory structures. We just finished the upper respiratory, and the lower respiratory is also known as the respiratory tree, and the reason it's called that is because it looks like an upside down tree, right? So you start with 1, 2, that's going to be the trachea. The trachea is going to split into the bronchi. So you go from trachea to primary bronchi to secondary bronchi to tertiary bronchi, and then they're going to become bronchioles. Okay, so bronchioles, and I'm going to talk about the difference between those in a second. And then they're going to terminate with these little like clusters of air sacs. Those are called alveoli. So trachea to primary bronchi to secondary bronchi to tertiary bronchi, then finish off with bronchioles and then alveoli, which are the little clusters, looks like little clusters of grapes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about function. We have 2 general zones for the respiratory tree. We have the conducting zones. Those are regions that just move air from one place to another place. There's no absorption, there's no gas exchange in those locations. They're just conducting air, moving it around. Then we have the respiratory zone, and the respiratory zone, that is where you're going to take the oxygen and you're going to bring it into the body, put it into the blood so that it can be taken to the cells of the body. And that's going to occur at the very, very, very last respiratory bronchioles, but primarily in those alveoli. And we're going to talk about the structure of the alveoli and how that helps with gas exchange. Okay, starting off with the conducting zones. These are regions that just move air around the body, but they are not bringing any air, no oxygen or carbon dioxide into or out of the body. Start off with the trachea. Here we have the trachea there. That's your windpipe. Okay, so that's going to be located right running down here. And at the top here, this is the larynx. So the larynx is only going to include this region where you can see the thyroid and the cricoid cartilage. Underneath that, starting with these smaller rings of hyaline cartilage, that's where the trachea begins. So the trachea is right here. And those cartilage rings are going to be C-shaped hyaline cartilage rings, and they're not going to go all the way in the back. Why not? What's behind the trachea? Okay, so remember in the previous big lecture, we talked about the trachea is in the front, and behind it is the esophagus. So the trachea carries air. What does the esophagus carry? It carries food. So when you are swallowing, that esophagus is going to have to expand outward as the food passes down through the esophagus. And so as the esophagus expands outward, it needs a place to go. And so it's going to expand out in this location here. So that's going to make sure that no food gets stuck in the esophagus. Now, please note on a quiz or an exam, do not ever say that food is in the trachea. There's no food in the trachea. The trachea does not expand. It's the esophagus behind the trachea that's going to do the expansion as the food goes through. Okay, that's a very common mistake that I get all the time. Okay, so let's look a little bit at the histology of the trachea. We've actually seen this already for lab. So this little circular purple C-shaped structure here, that is going to be made up of hyaline cartilage. I do want you to know the specific tissue types found here, so make sure you make note of that. So remember that hyaline cartilage, I call that glass with bubbles. A lot of air quotes in this lecture. Glass with bubbles here. Okay, because if you look at it here, you have your little caves where the cells live, the lacuna, and inside of the lacuna, that's where you're going to find your chondrocytes. Okay, so that, and then it has no fibers in the matrix, nice and smooth and glassy. So there's your hyaline cartilage here. And then the mucosa, which is the internal lining of the trachea, is going to be lined with pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Do you remember that? What do I mean by pseudostratified? Pseudostratified, pseudo as in fake, as in kind of looks like it, but not really. So if you're looking at this picture here, so here above all of this is the pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo as in fake, so it looks like it's stratified. It looks like there's multiple layers of nuclei. See all the nuclei here, but they don't actually form like even rows, right? So we can't really find where the different rows of the nuclei are. And that's because in reality, all of the cells go down and touch the basement membrane. So really there's only one single layer of cells, but the reason they look like there's multiple layers of cells is because you have some short cells, for example, these right here, and then you have some long cells that kind of lean over on top of those short cells. Okay, so short cells and long cells. If you have cells of various heights, that's going to force the nuclei to be kind of in different locations, and that's why it looks like it's stratified. Okay, so it's pseudostratified columnar because the long ones are column shaped. You can tell because here's the nucleus, you got some cytoplasm sticking on top of it. And then it's an epithelium because it's the lining of, it's on a surface of the cell. And then coming up the top, we have little cilia. Do you remember cilia? Those are those little hair-like extensions. And remember, cilia are different from microvilli because microvilli do not move. They just stick up and that's it, the increased surface area. Whereas these cilia, they move. What do you think they do? Why are they moving? Okay, as they move, they're going to create currents. And what's going to happen is the mucus that is secreted by these goblet cells, here are the goblet cells. Anytime you see a kind of fat, kind of clear staining cell, those are goblet cells, and they secrete mucus. And that mucus is going to trap bacteria or debris or dust or anything kind of going down into the lungs. And then the job of the cilia is to create those currents to sweep the debris and the pathogens up and out of your trachea into your throat so you can either swallow it or cough it out. Okay, so that's the function of the cilia and the goblet cells. Make sure you're familiar with those functions. Okay, so from the trachea is going to split into the bronchi, and then the bronchi will split again to the secondary bronchi and then the tertiary bronchi. And as you go further and further and further down into the respiratory tree, you're going to get less and less hyaline cartilage. So these rings, so look at the trachea, it goes all the way in a whole half, almost a whole circle, more like a C-shaped, I guess. But these hyaline rings are going to start breaking up as you go down. And so they create, instead of rings, they create plates. Okay, so you'll have less and less hyaline cartilage rings and more smooth muscle, sorry. And the function of the smooth muscle is to control the diameter of that respiratory passageway. So you can control how much air is going in and out. And so if you do have asthma, one of the things that happens with the asthma is you have spasming of that smooth muscle, and a spasm is just an uncontrolled contraction. And so when you have uncontrolled contraction, and that'll cause the narrowing to squeeze that respiratory tree. Okay, so you also have inflammation that helps. It's swelling that makes it harder to breathe as well. Okay, so back to this. Let's talk about the difference between bronchi. So for example, the difference between a tertiary bronchi and a bronchiole. So in this picture here, we have a tertiary bronchi. So it's much smaller, it's split it off. You can see that you only have plates, no rings anymore. You also have plenty of smooth muscle here. But look at once we get to a bronchiole. Once you get down to the bronchioles, you no longer have any hyaline cartilage. All you have is just a lot of smooth muscle surrounding it. Okay, so that's really the big difference between the tertiary bronchi, which is the plural form of bronchi, and the bronchioles. The bronchioles are much, much smaller branches, no more hyaline cartilage plates. Okay, so let's list them in order. Okay, so we'll go ahead and pause it, see if you can figure out the order of the structures that you're going to pass as you go deeper and deeper into the tree. So you're going to start with the trachea. The trachea will branch into the primary bronchi, then the secondary bronchi, then the tertiary bronchi. That'll then go into the bronchioles, and then the bronchioles will terminate with the alveoli, which are the little clusters of air sacs at the ends. So that's the function of the hyaline cartilage, the cilia, goblet cells, and smooth muscle. Okay, so again, go ahead and pause it, and then we'll go through it together. The hyaline cartilage. What's the function of most cartilages? What's the function of the connective tissues, the structured connective tissues? Remember, so bone and cartilage, what they do is they create structure and support. So in the trachea, as you're breathing, you're going to be changing the pressure in your thoracic cavity. And if you didn't have the cartilage to hold it open, the tube would collapse and then expand and collapse and expand. You want to hold it open so that you have easy airflow going through. So the function of the hyaline cartilage rings is to provide structure and support to hold open the airways. And so why are they incomplete in the back? So it's not about really the trachea changing in size, it's the esophagus that's right behind the trachea. So that as the esophagus expands, as the food goes through it, it has somewhere to expand into. Okay. The cilia, the function of all cilia is to move and create currents, and this specifically for this piece, it's to create currents to move the debris and the pathogens up and out of it so you don't clog up the lungs. The function of all goblet cells, we're going to see them again in the digestive system. The gut function of goblet cells is to secrete mucus that helps trap the bacteria and the pathogens, prevent it from getting down into the lungs. And then the smooth muscle is going to control the diameter of the passageway. Okay, let's get into the alveoli. So the alveoli, that is the primary place where you have the respiration, which just means you're going to have a gas exchange. And so the structure of the alveoli is very, very modified to be very good at its job. Okay, so one of the things that happens is instead of having just like one bulbous sac at the end, it has a bunch of tiny little sacs. Okay, so what we're looking at in this picture here is the respiratory bronchiole. So that is the very, very last of the bronchial endings. Okay, you can see the ribbons of smooth muscle all around them. And then everything else in this picture here, those are all alveoli. Okay, so what we've done, if you take a cross section through the little spheres, you make little circles. And so all of these little circles clustering all over around the outside, that is the alveoli. So most of the mass of the lungs is just tons and tons of alveoli all packed together. That's most of the mass of the lungs and the structure of the lungs. Okay, so what that does is the reason you have a whole bunch of little circles is that helps to increase the amount of surface area. So let's look at the relationship between surface area and gas exchange. So gas exchange just means that the oxygen is passing through the membrane and the carbon dioxide is going the other way. So oxygen into the body, carbon dioxide out of the body, and that's all in the process of cellular respiration to make energy for the cells. Okay, so that exchange here is going to have to happen at the surface, okay, so at the boundary of the alveoli. So if you have one giant sac, one giant alveoli, that means that you can only do exchange just at the surface, the boundary between the alveoli and the blood. Okay, so the more surface you have, just look at the amount of blue line here. The more surface you have, the more blue line you have, the more area you can do gas exchange, and therefore you're a lot more efficient at getting the oxygen in and the carbon dioxide out. Okay, so it's about increasing the amount of space at the surface. That's called surface area. Okay, the second thing that you need to know about the alveoli is that they're lined with simple squamous epithelium. And in fact, we've seen this already. So, oh, that should not be an S. Simple, just simple. Simple squamous epithelium. So squamous is flat. Simple means one. So one single layer of very flat cells. That makes it very, very thin, so it's very, very easy to get the oxygen into the blood. So if we're looking at this picture here, that the oxygen trying to get into the blood only has to go through two very, very thin layers, okay? Because here we have the alveolar cells, which are very, very thin, so thin squamous cells, just one layer. And then here we have the walls of the capillaries, which is also simple squamous epithelium. Okay, so very, very thin makes it very easy to penetrate in and get into the blood. Now, in that alveoli, we have two different types of cells. We have the alveolar cells, which are the ones that make up the structure of the wall. And then we have a second type of alveolar cells, and they secrete a fluid that's called surfactant, which is a type of detergent, I should say. Yeah, it sort of breaks up the surface. What's the word for that? Surface tension, that's the word I'm trying to think of. It breaks up the surface tension and allows for expansion. Okay, so the alveoli, the type 1 alveolar cells, those are the most common, most important ones that make up the wall of the alveoli. And again, simple squamous epithelium, you need to know that. I always want you to know specific tissue types and why they're important. So let's talk about it. So what is the functional significance? So how does it help the alveoli do their job? Why is it lined with simple squamous epithelium? And why does it have lots of surface area? Okay, so pause and see if you can write out a sentence for me. Okay, so simple squamous epithelium, flat, thin. Thin means easy to get through. Okay, surface area, the more surface you have, the more opportunities for that oxygen to come in contact with the surface and therefore pass through. Okay, so it makes it much, much more efficient at gas exchange. Okay, that's enough for now.